If you ask Battlefield fans what they think the best entry in the franchise was, you'll likely get one of three replies: Battlefield 3, Battlefield 4, or Bad Company 2. Bad Company 2 is 9 years old at this point. Can it still retain the crown of the best Battlefield in the franchise, 5 Battlefields after its release? There are a number of ways to evaluate a title from any franchise: how it stacked up to its contemporary competition, how it stacks up to its successor and other games that came after it. This video analyzes Bad Company 2, using historical and modern standards to ascertain its place in the Battlefield franchise, nearly a decade since its launch. Let's begin by looking at what Bad Company 2 excelled at: gunplay. Guns were well balanced within classes, and it was hard to say if there was a best assault rifle or best submachine gun. That does not mean you could not have your favorites though. For instance, I used the Gold Magnum more often than its alternatives, as it was the only sniper rifle that had no idle sway whatsoever. This is just as well, considering Bad Company 2 does not allow you to hold your breath to dampen the sway of the other sniper rifles. The Recon class reached its zenith in Bad Company 2, excelling at long range as expected, but also remaining viable at close range thanks to the 100 damage all bolt-action rifles did at point-blank distances. This is what gave rise to the forward recon, a strategy that is rarely seen in subsequent battlefields. Semi-automatic designated marksman rifles were not quite as powerful, requiring 3 shots to kill an enemy. DMRs would have to wait for Battlefield 3 to reach their pinnacle. More on that later. One of the DMRs was integrally suppressed though, which might make up for its lackluster damage. Bad Company 2 had another integrally suppressed rifle, the VSS, which was also the only fully automatic sniper rifle in the Battlefield series. Bad Company 2 also features 3D spotting, which lets you press Q to place a temporary mark over your target's heads and track their movements for a few seconds. This mechanic will be a staple of the Battlefield franchise for the next 8 years. You can net a few kills by firing at the marker even though you couldn't see the spotted target. This might be why spotting was removed from the franchise in 2018. Shooting at markers instead of soldiers is rather silly. Moving on to engineers. I found submachine guns to kill significantly faster than assault rifles, which in turn had a shorter time to kill than machine guns. Looking at the stats upgrades this observation from speculation to fact. Looking at assault rifles and submachine guns that fire 600 rounds per minute, the submachine gun kills in 5 shots while the assault rifle takes 6. This data would have been a lot easier to obtain had DICE communicated damage, range and rate of fire in raw numbers instead of vague sliders. Raw numbers would have made comparing guns trivially easy. As it stands, the in-game sliders are not just nondescript, they can be positively misleading. For example, the sliders suggest the AK-47 and M14 have the same rate of fire, when in reality the AK-47 fires 750 rounds per minute, 50 RPM faster than the M14 700 rounds per minute. Similarly, the sliders suggest the M21 does more damage than the SVD, when in reality they deal the exact same 39 damage with each shot. It's the same story with machine guns. The sliders suggest the RPK does more damage than the XM22, when in reality they deal the same 16.7 damage with each shot. If you take rate of fire into equation, the sliders are downright misleading. The XM22's 800 rounds per minute deal far more damage in the same time frame as the RPK's 650 rounds per minute. Sadly, subsequent battlefields did not embrace total transparency with regards to weapon statistics, though at least they do spell out the rate of fire in raw numbers. DICE just needs to get rid of sliders altogether. They don't just mislead players and hamper their ability to compare their weapon choices, they also waste a ton of screen space that could have otherwise displayed more information that could have helped players pick the right gun for their needs. Coming back to Bad Company 2, the weakness of light machine guns is exemplified by the XM8, the LMG variant of which takes 7 shots to kill while firing at the same 750 rounds per minute as the SMG and assault rifles XM8s, both of which kill in 6 shots. This damage imbalance between classes will be reduced somewhat in the Vietnam expansion, which still retains the crown of greatest content pack in the entire Battlefield franchise. None of the DLCs DICE has since released have managed to be as transformative as Vietnam was to Bad Company 2. Vietnam wound the clock back half a century, replacing the game's entire gun suite with period-appropriate weapons that look, sound and feel even more powerful than the base game. The 4 maps it introduced were also the most fun in the entire game, their diverse terrain allowing for intense combat at all ranges. Vietnam was so much fun it made me wish DICE had followed up with another expansion, one that wound the clock back even further to World War II. This was certainly hinted at with the availability of the M1 Grand, M1A1 Thompson and PPSH in multiplayer and the first single-player mission that took place during World War II. If they had fleshed them out into an expansion, we might have had a World War II battlefield worth playing. Going back to Bad Company 2 though, Vietnam also introduced a bug that hasn't yet been patched out to this day. Switching between Bad Company 2 and Vietnam resets all of your customization, meaning you have to set up your weapons and specializations all over again. This minor hiccup aside, Vietnam's visuals were a significant improvement over the base game, though I could have done without the desaturation. Drab colours were also an issue in maps from the base game, harkening back to a time where shooters were all tinted a dirty brown for the sake of conveying a gritty, realistic tone. Colours are not the only aspect of Bad Company 2's graphics to be relics of its time. The details of its textures and models also remind you of the game's age. Bad Company 2 was released in 2010, and it sure looks the part. Because it's such an old game though, performance is stellar on modern hardware. You can max this game out with an entry-level PC and still hit your frame cap. Loading times are also mercifully short. That being said, Bad Company 2 was the last Battlefield to not have a decisive lead in visual fidelity over its contemporary competitor from Call of Duty, largely thanks to Modern Warfare 2's vibrant colour palette. Now, many would argue gameplay is more important than graphics. So let's talk about what the game feels like to play. The reason we compare Modern Warfare 2 as a point of comparison is because that was the game Bad Company 2 had to compete with at the time of its release. However, we don't think the two can be compared in terms of gameplay, since they offer two entirely different experiences. Modern Warfare 2 was an infantry-focused shooter that abandoned any semblance of believability with its perks, dual-wield machine pistols and kill streaks. Bad Company 2 doesn't stray quite as far from reality while also placing much more emphasis on team coordination. Guns in Bad Company 2 feel much more authentic than in Modern Warfare 2, or indeed any game that competed with it at the time. Recoil in Bad Company 2 feels much more dynamic, with each part of the gun wobbling in a different direction. For instance, the way the sight moves differently from the barrel convinces you that your gun is a machine, comprised of several mechanical parts that each have their own inertia and react differently to the forces released by the action of the gun. This is in stark contrast to games like Modern Warfare and its sequel, where the gun moves as one in a static, predictable direction. It doesn't hurt that the guns sound like the powerful, lethal weapons that they're supposed to be. Sound design is excellent, as exemplified by the lingering impact explosions inflict on nearby infantry. If you survive an explosion, your hearing is temporarily muffled with tinnitus, giving you the impression you have been rendered partially deaf, at least temporarily. Sadly, this effect was not implemented in subsequent battlefields for reasons beyond our understanding. This was the same case with Bad Company 2's other strength, its single-player campaign. We won't spend too much time here, as Battlefield is primarily a multiplayer franchise. With that said, Bad Company 2 was the only Battlefield with a single player worth your time. The campaign's 4 characters are written better than any character in any Battlefield that succeeded Bad Company 2. The game doesn't take itself too seriously. This makes the story much more enjoyable than Battlefield 3 or 4's dull, monotonous campaigns. We wish DICE had just continued Bad Company 2's story in the later Battlefields. Of course, Bad Company 2's single-player is helped by its level design, which allows much more freedom than the linear, quick-time event-laden sequences of its successors. The freedom is occasionally taken away by the on-rails turret sequences, which is extremely frustrating as you can't move at all while still being vulnerable to enemy fire. As you have no protection whatsoever, you are literally a sitting duck and will die over and over before you get lucky enough to survive the sequence and move on. Even after you regain control of your mobility, you might still struggle to find cover as everything you try to hide behind can and will be destroyed. Speaking of destruction, Bad Company 2 achieved a level of perfection that no game has managed to recapture since. Rainbow Six Siege could be argued to be a contender as it does feature extensive destruction, but this is restricted to a much smaller scale than Bad Company 2. You can punch holes in walls with shotguns or explosives and destroy predetermined hatches in the ceiling. But beyond that, there is little else. Bad Company 2 lets you level entire buildings to the ground, completely destroying any cover infantry might have taken shelter in. Infantry were further hampered by the inexplicable inability to go prone, a baffling omission of a feature that is otherwise omnipresent in all other shooters. This makes you feel like a sitting duck and is often the leading cause of frustration when you cannot do anything about dying over and over, sometimes mere seconds after you spawn. The inability to prone is just one of many modern conveniences you'll start to miss when playing Bad Company 2. There is no health indicator, meaning you do not know how much damage you have taken and how long it will take for your regeneration to bring you back to full health. Ironically, the enemies you kill get to see your health. Medics on your team get to see your health. You are the only one who isn't given that information. Indeed, you won't even know you've recovered all of your health unless you look out for the audio cue, which might go unnoticed amidst the pandemonium of battle. This might work fine in a game like Call of Duty, where health regeneration is rapid, but Battlefield games make automatic healing painfully slow in order to accentuate the importance of medkits. If you come to Bad Company 2 after playing one of the more recent Battlefields, the lack of a health indicator will quickly be a thorn in your side. This dearth of information is not the only aspect that betrays Bad Company 2's age. The game's approach to customization is primitive at best, unwisely conflating weapon attachments and soldier specializations into the same categories. This forces you to choose between either equipping an optical sight for your primary weapon or a perk like additional reserves of ammunition or explosives. You cannot both equip, say, a red dot sight on your rifle and bring additional grenades at the same time. Why? One is nothing like the other. How does it make sense to force a choice between these? This is remarkably similar to a contemporaneous competition from Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, which allowed just one attachment for your weapons, unless you sacrifice your primary perk for bling, which increased the limit to a paltry 2. Bad Company 2 also allowed you to equip a second attachment by sacrificing another specialization, though this second attachment differed based on the selected class. For instance, the Assault class could equip a foregrip, though how this is possible on a rifle that has an underslung grenade launcher is not explained. Indeed, there is no difference in the gun's model with the foregrip selected, which makes me wonder how this attachment made its way into the final build. It's a similar story with the Engineer's exclusive attachment. Submachine guns, the Engineer's primary weapon, saw no change in the models with the second attachment, the silencer. In Bad Company 2, SMGs were already silenced even without the specialization. This wasn't the case in the Vietnam expansion, though here the silencer specialization still did nothing, as even with it equipped, submachine guns were still unsuppressed. Reading the strategy wiki provides insight on the true purpose of these two attachments, reducing the spread of fire from the hip and when aimed down the sight. This would have been much more intuitive as a soldier specialization, akin to Modern Warfare's steady aim. As it stands, it makes no sense for these phantom attachments to provide the same benefit, one which is, at best, poorly explained by in-game text. Let's move on to other aspects frequently cited as Bad Company 2's strengths. Map design. While many point to Bad Company 2 as the pinnacle of Battlefield's rush mode, I was not a fan of how a couple of its maps balance the attacker and defender positions. Let's look at Valparaiso as an example. The attackers start on an elevated position while defenders face an uphill battle. Literally. Having the high ground over your enemy is a huge advantage in combat, one which Bad Company 2 awards right off the bat. Any competent attacking team will make quick work of the first stage, and this predictability makes the game feel less exciting and less fair. Of course, the subsequent stages do not bestow nearly as big an advantage to either side, but it's just as boring knowing that the first stage is a done deal. The attackers have plenty of cover in the rocks and vegetation that stick out from the slopes, while the defenders have little to shield themselves. To make matters worse, the attackers get a Bradley fighting vehicle to bombard the objectives from atop the hill, and a Black Hawk helicopter to circle and harass the defender's spawn point. If you're on defense, this stage is a miserable experience. You'll just want to get it over with and move on to a stage that actually gives you a fighting chance. Thankfully, not all maps were as one-sided, and there is good fun to be had in other modes, though the action might not be as intense since Rush does tend to focus the combat into tighter lanes. No matter if you're playing Rush or Conquest, you might be annoyed by the 32-player cap, which is noticeably sparse for a Battlefield title. A few have speculated that console limitations are to blame for this, as Bad Company 2 does seem to have a tangibly smaller scope than the other Battlefields. Planes aren't even in the game, except for a few of the short cutscenes that play after a multiplayer match has ended. Additionally, the way Bad Company 2 handles tickets and revives might feel antiquated if you're used to a newer Battlefield. Death is counted immediately upon getting downed, and is not refunded if you are revived. Your team is refunded the tickets, but your initial death is still counted. If you are killed again, you get 2 deaths for the same soldier, which makes no sense. This is especially aggravating if your medics are reckless and don't bother to dispatch the threat before moving in to revive. Thankfully, this was fixed in Battlefield 3 and the Battlefields that followed, along with other improvements that we will dig into in our next video. Please like, subscribe and press the bell button so you don't miss out. That concludes our retrospective review of Bad Company 2. If you like this video, please share it. While you're here, feel free to watch our analysis on Denuvo's history and performance impact, our analysis of Battlefield 5's controversies, and our hardware analysis of CPUs and graphics cards. We have a secondary channel, link is in the description and on the screen. Please subscribe, and don't forget to press the bell button.